Good morning, good afternoon. This is Lisa Sotto. I lead the privacy and cybersecurity practice at Hunton Kurth, and I am delighted to welcome you and introduce our session today on key issues under the GDPR related to the COVID-19 pandemic, with a focus on recovery as the EU opens up, as the world starts to open up. I'd like to do a few housekeeping items before we dive in. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and if time permits, we will aim to address those questions at the end of the presentation. And otherwise, do feel free to email us directly, and we will get back to you. Also, the webinar is being recorded, so we'll make a recording available following the program, so you will have that available to you. Now, I'd like to introduce my colleagues who will be joining us today from Hunton's Brussels office. With us is David Dumont. David is a partner in our Brussels office, and his practice focuses on all aspects of GDPR compliance. And he's currently assisting many clients with data protection questions related to COVID-19, now recovery measures. It was confinement measures at the beginning, now recovery measures, which is really nice to see. Also joining us is Anna Pateraki. Anna is a senior associate on our privacy team in the Brussels office. Anna also advises on a panoply of EU and international data protection issues, and she's currently also immersed in advising on recovery measures. So with that, let's get started. I'd like to start by giving you a sense of our perspective and a little bit about who we are. So we are all over the world. Many of you on the program today know us. We're quite global. We advise in every industry sector. We don't specialize in a particular sector because this is really such a nascent area, and so we're working very much across industry sectors. For those of you who are very interested in this area, I would commend you to our Center for Information Policy Leadership website, where we have many papers on both the GDPR and on pandemic issues as well. And I would also commend you to our privacy blog, and no privacy practice would be complete without a Twitter handle. So there it is on the screen for you. Next slide, please. Okay, let's go to the roadmap, please. So just to, whoops, back one. Okay, just to give you a sense of what we're going to cover today, David is going to provide an overview of the most significant EU data protection guidance on COVID-19 issues. And then we'll talk about some key issues with respect to implementing recovery measures and reopening businesses and schools, etc. I'll then talk a little bit about cybersecurity threats and legal considerations, and Anna will summarize the guidance of data protection authorities in the EU regarding recommendations for safe teleworking. And then we'll close the program with some recommendations for maintaining privacy programs during the pandemic. Remember, your privacy program can't fall by the wayside just because there's so much else going on. So we will we'll address that as well. David, over to you.
Thanks, Lisa. The COVID-19 outbreak and the measures that have been taken all over the world to fight the spread of the virus have presented and are actually continuing to present unprecedented challenges for everyone in society, including for businesses. And the focus during this pandemic has been and should, of course, continue to be on ensuring people's safety and health. But that said, the protection of individuals' privacy and personal data should not be lost completely out of sight while doing so. Many of the measures that have been taken in response to the pandemic involve new and very particular data processing activities, which, similar to the pandemic itself, have an important impact on individuals' private life. And as Lisa already mentioned, during this webinar, we will be discussing some of the key data protection considerations around COVID-19 related measures and focused on recovery measures that we've seen companies in the EU implement. Before tackling some of the practical questions that we've seen in our practice related to specific measures that companies are implementing to protect health and safety at their premises and to ensure continuity of their business and privacy programs, I will first give a bit of an overview of the main topics that EU data protection authorities have been focusing on during this pandemic and summarize some of the key takeaways that we can deduce from the data protection authorities' guidance around these topics. So, both the privacy community and data protection regulators have been very active during this crisis situation. Many data protection authorities around the globe, including in the EU, have issued guidance to assist both the public and private sector in finding the right balance between taking necessary and effective measures to reduce the spread of the virus, while limiting the impact on individuals' privacy as much as possible. Specifically in the EU, almost all, if not all, EU data protection authorities have actually issued COVID-19 related guidance or statements since the outbreak of the virus in Europe. And the guidance issued by national data protection authorities in the various EU jurisdictions significantly varies, both in form and scope and in actual substance. In terms of scope, most of the data protection authorities in the EU have issued guidance around the key questions and issues that companies and the public face with respect to the lawfulness of certain of these specific data processing activities that take place as a result of measures taken in the fight against the pandemic. Often these measures involve processing of personal data of employees or visitors, for example, that in normal circumstances you would never process. Think, for example, about someone's body temperature. We will be discussing a number of these questions and issues in more detail later during our webinar. As more and more countries went into the lockdown mode, resulting in companies closing their offices, we saw a second wave of guidance from EU data protection authorities that was specifically focused on the data protection risks and challenges related to the confinement measures. Data protection authorities started to focus on the various risks related to remote working, for example, including the increased cybersecurity risks, which Lisa will talk about a bit, and the challenges around ensuring continuity of the organization's privacy program, while a lot of people and resources are not available on site, and Anna will touch on that later on. Over the past weeks, the regulators' focus is shifting towards the lawfulness of contact tracing apps that are being rolled out in various EU member states to track and prevent the further spread of the virus in the post-lockdown era. Although there are certainly initiatives in this respect in the private sector, contact tracing initiatives and the related data protection issues are, at least at this stage, typically more a concern for governments, and we'll not be focusing in too much detail on these issues during today's webinar. But in general, I think we can say that at EU level, the European Commission stressed the need for a harmonized approach to contact tracing apps in the EU. And from a data protection point of view, the European Data Protection Board echoed this call from the European Commission, acknowledging that contact tracing apps will be more effective if they are interoperable. But at the same time, they emphasize that such interoperability also creates some specific data protection issues. And in a recent statement of earlier this month, the EDPB, for example, flagged a number of key data protection challenges that require specific attention in the context of interoperability of tracing apps, such as the need for users to have control over the sharing of their data between apps and the need for specific information around such sharing and potentially specific consent or other legal basis for such sharing. And they also flagged specific information security related risks related to interoperability between different tracing apps. In practice, we've not seen much of a harmonized approach in the EU so far. Different countries have taken different approaches to contact tracing apps. Some countries have developed their own apps, others have worked with private companies to do so. Some use a decentralized model, others use a centralized model where all data is centralized, and in the decentralized model, data remains on user devices. So not really a harmonized approach in the EU so far. We're also seeing private sector companies develop their own contact tracing solutions, but they're still really often in the early stage of development, and we've not seen many regulators issue specific guidance on these so far. So these are, at least at a very high level, some of the main topics that EU data protection authorities have been focusing on during the pandemic. And on the next slides, I now want to zoom in on some of the new COVID specific data processing activities that we've seen arising during the different phases of the pandemic, and how EU data protection authorities have been generally addressing these in their guidance towards companies. So, as already mentioned, most data protection authorities in the EU have issued guidance on questions around the lawfulness of certain new and specific data processing activities that are taking place in connection with measures that private companies have implemented in their fight against the pandemic, which often involve processing of employees and visitors' personal data. In the guidance of the different data protection authorities in the EU, and also in the work that we do with our clients, we see a number of frequently recurring types of COVID-19 related processing activities that companies, were considering at the start of the pandemic, before the state of lockdown was declared in many countries, and are now again looking into in relation to reopening their business in a post-lockdown era. The first issue that we've seen many EU data protection authorities address in their guidance, and that we in our practice have also received many questions about from our clients, is whether it's permitted to conduct temperature checks. There has been a lot of focus on this, both on the industry and the regulator side, and we will be touching on this in a bit more detail later on. We've also seen many companies struggle with questions around what information they are allowed to ask and track about their employees in relation to COVID-19. For example, can you ask your employees about whether they've been experiencing any COVID-19 related symptoms, or whether their family members have been infected or have been potentially exposed to the virus, whether they've been visiting areas where a lot of infections have been reported, and so on. So, to the extent that companies are permitted to collect this type of information, a question arises on whether it's also allowed to disclose this information about potential infections to other employees or customers or visitors and so on. Another practical question we've seen companies struggle with is whether, from a business continuity perspective, they are allowed to ask and process their employees' personal contact details to make sure that they can continue to communicate with their employees in case they are suddenly no longer able to come to the workplace. And a final measure we're seeing companies consider now is, as I already mentioned, is implementing their own contact tracing solutions through, for example, phone applications or wearables. But as mentioned, this type of initiatives are generally still in a pretty early stage, and not many regulators have issued specific guidance on this issue so far. So, although there's certainly consistency in the topics of EU that EU data protection authorities have covered in their guidance around COVID-19, let's now have a look on the next slide as to whether there's the same level of consistency in their actual guidance on these common topics. And luckily, there is at least a certain level of consistency in the guidance issued by different EU data protection authorities, in the sense that they generally take the view that the GDPR does not prevent the processing and disclosure of personal data that is necessary to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. That said, they at the same time emphasize that even in the emergency state that we are currently, still facing, the main data protection principles under EU data protection law must be respected. The first important principle under the GDPR is, of course, lawfulness. And the lawfulness principle under the GDPR entails that all data processing activities, including those in relation to COVID-19, require a legal basis. The available legal bases are listed exhaustively in Article 6 of the GDPR and include things like consent, the necessity of the processing for the performance of a contract, the necessity of the processing for compliance with a legal obligation, the necessity of the processing for vital interest, to protect the vital interest of an individual, or to achieve a public interest or a legitimate interest pursued by the company. To the extent that sensitive personal data, such as health data, is being processed, which is, of course, often the case in the context of COVID-19 related measures, in addition to a legal basis under Article 6, one of the conditions set forth in Article 9 of the GDPR should be satisfied too. And Article 9 actually provides a more limited and stricter list of conditions, of which at least one must be satisfied to legitimize the processing of sensitive personal data. This list in Article 9, for example, includes explicit consent of the concerned individuals. With respect to this lawfulness principle, EU data protection authorities have slightly different views on what the available and most appropriate legal bases are for legitimizing the different types of COVID-19 related data processing activities. That said, most data protection authorities seem to agree that employers can rely on the legal obligation basis to legitimize the processing of data resulting from COVID-19 detection and prevention measures, meaning that companies can typically assert that the data processing is necessary to comply with their legal obligation as an employer to ensure the health and safety of their employees. Obtaining the employee's consent is typically not required and even generally not considered an appropriate legal basis in the employment context due to the imbalance of power between the employee and the employer, rendering the consent invalid under the GDPR. We are, however, now seeing a shift to some data protection authorities, such as the Belgian one, taking the view that the obligation to ensure safety at the workplace is too vague to legitimize some COVID-19 related processing activities, such as the use of thermal scanners, for example. And they're really pushing the national legislator to adopt a more specific legislation that could serve as a legal basis for companies to carry out this type of activities. Another set of EU data protection law principles that are important in relation to COVID-19 are proportionality, data minimization, and purpose limitation. EU data protection authorities have really stressed the need to limit the data processing activities to what is strictly necessary for COVID-19 prevention and detection purposes, and to minimize the collection of data to what is strictly necessary to comply with their health and safety obligations. Furthermore, it's also important to ensure that this limited data is not used for any non-COVID related purposes. Linked to these principles, another key data protection principle is storage limitation. This entails that data processed in connection with COVID-19 detection and prevention measures should only be kept in an identifiable form for as long as necessary to achieve the purposes for which it was collected. In light of this, it's important to determine specific data retention periods for the data collected in connection with the fight against the pandemic, and to make sure that these retention periods are also applied in practice. I'm not aware of any EU data protection authorities that have identified specific retention periods, but generally the data should be kept only for the duration of the COVID-19 crisis. And proportionality is also important when determining the periods for which the measures may be put in place. Companies should assess the necessity of the measures on a periodic basis and terminate them as soon as they are no longer necessary, taking into consideration the situation, for example, the level of infections in the region where they're located. Another common takeaway from the different data protection authorities guidelines is that transparency is crucial. The GDPR sets forth comprehensive notice obligations. It lists actually in detail which information needs to be provided to individuals when processing their personal data. And from the regulator's guidance, it's clear that meeting the GDPR transparency obligations is not only important because not doing so constitutes, of course, in itself an infringement of the GDPR, but the level of transparency will also have an impact on the legitimacy of the data processing activities as such. In addition, and this is also related to transparency, in a number of EU jurisdictions, it will be required to inform and/or consult employee representative bodies or even obtain their approval when implementing COVID-19 related measures. And here, companies will really need to look at what is required at member state level, as there's no harmonization of these requirements at pan-EU level. The final point that all data protection authorities stress in their COVID-19 related guidance is the need to take appropriate technical and organizational measures to adequately protect the data. This is referred to in the GDPR as the data integrity and confidentiality principle. And taking into account the often sensitive nature of personal data that is being processed in connection with COVID-19 prevention and detection, many EU data protection authorities have emphasized the need to implement strong security policies and confidentiality policies, ensuring that the personal data that is collected in connection with these COVID-19 related measures is not disclosed to unauthorized parties. In addition to these principles, I also want to mention that accountability is an important underlying principle in the GDPR, meaning that it's not only important to ensure compliance with the principles I've just discussed, it's equally important to be able to demonstrate compliance with these principles. In light of this, the safeguards that are put in place to ensure compliance with the EU data protection principles should be properly documented. We've seen many of our clients develop protocols in which they reflect and document the safeguards they've implemented to limit the impact of the company's COVID-19 related measures on their employees' privacy. In addition to these type of SOPs and protocols, typically data processing activities in relation to COVID-19 will also trigger the need for data protection impact assessment, as sensitive data is involved about employees. And of course, these processing activities will also need to be reflected in the company's internal records of data processing activities that are required to be maintained under GDPR. Despite the consistency in the general message of the data protection authorities, there are differences in how the regulators have interpreted the exact application of these principles to the various data processing scenarios we discussed earlier. As a consequence, although, as a company operating in various EU jurisdictions, you may be able to develop a pan-EU approach around the main data protection principles. There may be specific requirements or restrictions in relevant countries where you have operations that must be looked into and reflected in your pan-EU approach. And sometimes there may even be a need to take a tailored approach for a specific country due to specific restrictions or requirements in that particular country that cannot really be accommodated in your pan-EU approach. Let's now look a bit closer at how the GDPR principles apply specifically to some of the measures that companies are taking or are considering to take in the post-lockdown recovery phase, where they are reopening their business. We can actually skip to slide 9, which again gives an overview of the main data protection principles under EU data protection law that I've just discussed. So necessity, proportionality, purpose limitation, data minimization, storage limitation, security and confidentiality, and accountability. And we'll keep that slide with the overview of these principles up during our discussion of the practical questions that Lisa will be asking us, as these principles will, always be the starting point and the backbone of any analysis of COVID-19 related measures from an EU data protection law perspective. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Lisa, to start our discussion.
Okay, terrific. And we now have a good grounding in what the rules of the road are. So I'm going to ask David and also Anna some practical questions that we have been asked over and over and over with respect to recovery. So first, David, let's start with you. Can I take, if I'm an employer, can I take my employee's temperature?
Well, Lisa, as mentioned, there's been a lot of focus on temperature checks because, this is one of the most obvious measures that organizations can implement to identify infected individuals and prevent them from accessing their premises. Now, temperature checks are, of course, generally considered rather privacy intrusive, and although not completely prohibited, implementing such measures does raise a number of challenges under the EU data protection law. And EU data protection authorities, have been, as I mentioned, heavily focused on these challenges in the immediate aftermath of the COVID-19 outbreak. And they've really issued their guidance around this issue in an emergency fashion without really discussing with their counterparts in other EU jurisdictions. And this has led to different positions as to whether, and if so, how temperature checks should be conducted in the various EU member states. We've seen, for example, countries like the Netherlands taking a very hardline approach with respect to temperature checks, not only stating that private sector employers are not allowed to carry out such checks, but also indicating that they would take enforcement action if they would become aware of a company performing such checks. Also, in France and Luxembourg and Belgium, systematic and generalized body temperature checks through, for example, the use of thermal scanners are considered unlawful. More and more, these countries do provide a bit more flexibility if temperature checks are performed on a voluntary basis, provided that no actual temperature readings or other personal data is recorded, because these DPAs take the view that if that's the case, actually the GDPR does not apply because there's no processing of personal data. In some jurisdictions, we've now also seen that, like Germany and Austria, for example, that national data protection authorities have actually raised questions around the necessity, or whether temperature checks would ever meet the necessity principle under the GDPR, because fever is not always an indicator of COVID-19, and not all individuals infected by COVID-19 have fever. And other countries, on the other hand, such as Italy, Spain, and the UK, which, unsurprisingly have been heavily affected by the virus, seem to take a bit more of a flexible approach vis-a-vis temperature checks, provided that the necessary safeguards are put in place. I think, of course, in practice, it's not always feasible to tailor an approach on a member state by member state basis. So some companies have decided to take a pan-EU approach, which is understandable. But if you do so, I think there's a couple of key points that I just want to mention that are important to consider to mitigate any risks related to this, varying local guidance. And the first thing I want to flag is, the importance of proportionality and to consider proportionality. So it should really be considered whether it's possible to ensure health and safety at the business premises by using less invasive measures. And if, the outcome of that analysis is that it's not the case, I would recommend documenting the reasons why this is not the case and why other less intrusive means are not sufficient to achieve the envisaged purpose. Another key point is, implement these temperature checks on a voluntary basis where possible. And also, as I already mentioned, be transparent, right? Transparency is really crucial, and providing advance notice to anyone who may be impacted by the temperature checks is really key. And then the last point I want to make is, to the extent that, or your employees or your personnel that will be conducting these checks, it's important to appropriately train these individuals so they are aware of the data protection considerations in relation to this activity. And if a vendor is involved in that process, it's important to have a proper agreement with this vendor that implements all the data protection obligations that are required under Article 28 of the GDPR. So these are a bit of my main takeaways on that question, Lisa.
Thank you, David. And that's really helpful. And actually, you touched on a number of my other questions. So let me direct the next one to Anna. And you've touched on this a little bit, but I think we can draw it out a bit to get really practical. So Anna, if I take temperature of my employees, how can I store the data? And if I store the data, how long can I store it? There may be some use in storing the data in telling me, for example, that employee X should not return to work for 2 weeks. But is it permissible to store the data that I collect, and how long can I keep it?
Thanks, Lisa. So, as we said, EU data protection authorities have shown a preference of not recording the data, so preferably not storing the data and doing manual checks where possible. But there will be situations where you might need to record the data and store it for a short period of time. If you decide to do so, the duration of the storage cannot be long. The data protection authorities have not been too specific on retention periods in relation to temperature tests, leaving it up to the companies to decide for how long they need the data. But what you need to consider in the context of defining the retention period is what is the purpose of the data collection. And here, typically, it is to ensure health and safety of employees at work at the time where someone has fever. So there is kind of an immediate purpose to be attained soon after the temperature measurement has been made. So thinking of this short, immediate purpose to achieve the duration of the storage of temperature measurement should not exceed a couple of days. Obviously, if local law permits longer storage or if the data is anonymized, the storage can be longer. But one thing to consider is you may need to keep some information to manage certain administrative issues. For example, if an employee has been denied access to the premises because of having fever of, example, 37.5 degrees Celsius, you might need to keep some information for administration of granting sick leaves or making the monthly payments to that employee, etc. That doesn't mean that you need the actual measurement of the fever in that record. So the recommendation is, while you need some information to do administrative work, try to redact information that associates the employee with COVID-19 and specific measurement levels. There could be other recovery measures that could justify a longer retention period. So it's not only temperature tests, but for example, if you ask employees to fill in questionnaires, then you may have another range. Again, the retention period will be shorter, and I think some regulators prefer 1 to 3 months for these other recovery measures, depending on a case-by-case basis. The general rule, however, is that retention period should not be long, and the data should be deleted after the pandemic has stopped.
Thank you, Anna. That's really helpful. And David, you touched on this a little bit, but what kind of temperature taking is permissible, and how does that vary by country, as between thermal imaging and straight-on forehead thermometers?
Right. Well, first of all, Lisa, in some countries, the local data protection authority has actually taken a specific position around the type of temperature reading devices that can be used. The French DPA, for example, takes a view that, as I already mentioned, thermal scanners and similar technologies that automatically and systematically capture body temperatures are not allowed. And earlier this month, the Belgian DPA has actually taken a similar position, indicating that organizations may not conduct temperature checks using sophisticated means, such as thermal cameras or digital temperature scanners or other automated measuring means. These, type of more advanced means of measuring temperatures do raise apparently issues in certain jurisdictions. The French DPA and the Belgian DPA and similar jurisdictions, they have indicated that, for example, simple reading of individuals' temperatures without actually recording the data, by using these forehead thermometers, is not problematic or is less problematic because there it doesn't constitute a data processing activity, so they do allow some flexibility around that. I think that, one thing I want to mention here is that the Belgian DPA has even reached out to the Brussels airport, which I really found interesting, and asked questions around the deployment of their thermal scanners, and they've already indicated in the press that they have some serious concerns around that, which I found really striking, given that, it's an airport and you would expect thermal scanners to be implemented, or at least I would do so. But, that's my view on it. In general, apart from these countries that have specific positions around what type of measures there can be put in place, I think as a general rule, DPAs do prefer, manual forehead thermometers rather than, more sophisticated solutions such as thermal scanners and so on, because it's just a more targeted approach and typically leads to, the collection of smaller amounts of personal data. And that's not to say that, in some situations there may be, a specific context where the use of these thermal scanners is justifiable, right? Because you have a huge business premise, or you have a lot of people. So, yeah, I think it depends on country by country.
Okay, thank you. And in the same vein, Anna, I'll pose this one to you. Can I ask employees for antibody tests before they go back to the office? Is that permissible?
This is a very good question. So in principle, yes, under conditions, and there are legal bases in the GDPR that allow for such data collection. But one thing to keep in mind is that there is a specific legal basis that allows occupational medicine data processing in this context, but that will be basically in cases where the testing takes place or is instructed by the company doctor. In any event, these tests should not be made mandatory, similar to the temperature test. And from a proportionality perspective, companies should be seeking to explore less invasive means. So what is important here is to see if an employee is fit or unfit to work. So ultimately, you don't need the full medical record of the test, but perhaps a confirmation that the test has been made or a result of it. or even just to show the certificate, but not to keep it. From a data minimization perspective, you would not want to have a medical record in your system and risk a data breach with this data.
That's great. Thank you, Anna. And, back to you, Anna, really, really practical here. What do I do if someone with a high fever comes into my workplace? How do I manage that?
So it really depends how the fever was detected. So imagine that someone feels unwell at work and use a manual thermometer to take his temperature. That's sufficient. So the person should not be forced to have his or her personal data captured through an automatic process or undergo thermal imaging scanning just for the purpose of collecting the data electronically. And if the fever was detected during a routine check, then the usual safeguards should be in place, like the ones the company would have taken to conduct this forehead thermometers checks or thermal imaging machines if permitted. So, of course, you can ask questions, keep note of the issue, and follow up with the employee to see if they're symptom-free, but there are other legal bases to allow such processing.
So, we've heard now about recovery measures and how we deal with them under the GDPR, and we'll now turn to other related issues that companies need to be considering during the pandemic, and we will start first with cybersecurity issues. With so many employees working on personal devices outside the four walls of an office now, there's so much more that a threat actor can do to go after work devices and business information. And you can really have a fortress-like environment in the office. But once everything is outside those castle walls, it's really much harder to control, number one. And number two, the attackers have so much more surface area to hit if they're looking to do so. We're seeing that cyber criminals are indeed targeting remote workers, and they're exploiting vulnerabilities in remote working tools and personal devices alike. And we're seeing, for example, that many VPNs were built on legacy servers with vulnerabilities, and these are now being exploited when the VPNs are running on old infrastructure that hasn't been patched or updated. And of course, businesses worked fast, really quickly, to push out remote working tools. We needed to rush to make sure that we had remote capabilities. And of course, this is a vulnerability. This is a recipe for vulnerabilities as we pushed these out so quickly. We're also seeing, of course, that Zoom bombing is real. There is truly, there was earlier, less now, but there were certainly teleconferences that were hijacked, and there are protections that we sort of think of as silver bullets, like multi-factor authentication, but in fact, they're not the be-all, end-all. They're good, yes, absolutely, they're good, but we're still seeing compromises even where multi-factor authentication is in place. For example, we see employees who are mindlessly hitting yes on push notifications, even if it's not really them who are initiating those pushes. And they'll think the request is legitimate, and of course this results in negative consequences. We're also seeing other exploits where security protocols are being, like multi-factor authentication, are being bypassed for various operational reasons. For example, they're opened up and then forgotten, so they're never closed. An example of this is when debug mode is enabled. And of course, once systems are opened up and the attacker gets in, it's over. They're in. So we need to take these precautions times 10. We're seeing also quite a bit of government-sponsored espionage targeting COVID-19, and specifically targeting intellectual property and medical research, as well as policy plans. There was recently an alert, a joint alert on APT threats from the US and the UK together, warning about heightened nation-state threats to healthcare, pharmaceutical, et cetera. And what we're seeing is that these APT groups are using the pandemic as part of their sort of typical cyber espionage operations, masquerading as trusted entities with coronavirus-themed messages in an effort to steal sensitive research data as well as IP for both commercial and state benefit. Next slide, please. So we're seeing really significant social engineering threats where bad actors are seeking access to credentials to install malware. And, you know, these are the same exploits that we saw pre-COVID, but now they're using COVID-related lures to get in. They're using the pandemic for commercial gain through attacks like phishing, using the pandemic as the lure, malware distribution, using COVID-related themes. They're attacking remote access and teleworking tools and infrastructure. We're seeing spoofed websites that look like COVID update sites, but they're not. Need to be particularly careful. And the thing that's really galling about all of this is that they're targeting vulnerable groups like the elderly, like the unemployed, small businesses that are just desperate for any measure of help they can get. We're also seeing them masquerading as healthcare workers, you know, really offensive in my mind, and also prospective employers to people who are just desperate for work. And what they're doing is they're disguising malicious attachments or links as coronavirus updates or status reports or advisories or reimbursements. You know, we can all imagine the types of exploits that would get people's attention. So criminals are relying on the usual social engineering methods to entice users who are rightfully concerned about the pandemic. And they're persuading victims to take action, for example, with respect to an email that appears to come from a physician or the World Health Organization. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about legal considerations here. So it is critical to implement industry standard safeguards to make sure that you're protecting information that is accessed from the home. You have to think much harder than we've ever thought in the past about remote access protections. I've provided some examples here: multi-factor authentication, certainly encryption, data loss prevention tools, very important as well. Workforce awareness is critical. Make sure you're constantly sending alerts to employees to remind them of the threats and to help them secure their systems and devices on an ongoing basis, because new threats are not the subject of old awareness alerts. So we need to fight tomorrow's battle, not yesterday's battle in these alerts. Also, be sure that you have the right policies in place and that your employees know about them. So acceptable use policies, for example, that lay out the rules of the road for remote workers. And these policies, for example, might inform workers that you may, as the employer, be monitoring certain online activities if you're permitted by law to do so. And that's going to be very much jurisdiction specific. You also need to think about any additional legal requirements that are associated with protecting data in remote working environments. Make sure you have reasonable safeguards in place for remote work. And you know, one example of this is the payment card industry data security standard. And we've moved very fast now from card present transactions to card not present transactions. So we have to ensure that our compliance framework relates to the tools we're using now as a society and not yesterday's manner of operating. The compliance obligations didn't change. They stayed the same. So we need to shift our method of operations to make sure that we're doing what we need to do under those same compliance frameworks. And of course, this goes without saying, but it may not be so obvious to everybody. You have to keep a close eye out for data breaches in the context of remote work. there is absolutely heightened risk now associated with personal devices. And what we absolutely have seen is that in the early weeks of remote work, these were not reported so quickly. IT staff was absolutely swamped with just keeping people up and running. And they were so busy that they weren't detecting issues as quickly as they otherwise might have. So these issues sort of lurked around for a while. And over the last few weeks, we've seen a real uptick in newly identified breaches as IT staff had a little bit more time to breathe because they had gotten the systems up and running, everything was working smoothly, and then, they figured out that there was a threat actor in the system doing its thing. So we have to be particularly careful in that regard. Okay, so let's turn then to Anna to talk to us about safe teleworking.
Thank you, Lisa. So as you know, the pandemic has resulted in an enormous number of employees who work remotely. And for some companies, teleworking is here to stay, as even if businesses are now reopening offices. In this session, we would like to summarize some of the main takeaways and best practices for teleworking that we identified by going through the relevant data protection guidance from the data protection authorities in the EU. You may have seen that employees have set minimum rules for their employees to follow when they work remotely. And this may include the use of multi-factor authentication on company devices and services for network access. You'll see also that companies now review access logs regularly, perhaps more regularly than before, to detect suspicious behaviors as we now have an uptick of cybersecurity attacks. Companies have procedures in place or should have procedures in place for safe data sharing while teleworking, and be able to remote wipe off company devices if they get lost or stolen. Encryption is a must and should be used as much as possible on devices, networks, and when sharing files, especially if they contain sensitive data. Now, if you're an employee working remotely, you likely have been asked to follow the instructions of your employer regarding how to protect your device, email, and paper records. Use secure internet connection to work from home, and always have a strong password. Also, make sure that your devices have all the relevant updates, firewalls, antivirus protection, and this is all common ground in all the relevant DPA guidance. When you transmit data, make sure you do this securely, and be sure you have training to identify phishing emails and don't open links promising you COVID-19 information material from sources you don't know. Importantly, know at all times who to contact to report the loss or theft of a company-owned device. So these are very common grounds in all the relevant guidance, and would like to highlight a few additional measures that the local DPAs recommended. For example, in France, the DPA pointed out that companies should be using or making available VPNs for employees to work so that they avoid direct exposure of the company services on the internet, and ensure that employees' laptops block access to malicious sites. In Ireland, the DPA suggested that employees take extra care not to lose their devices, to minimize who else can view the screen, lock their device as they don't use. And if by any chance they need to use personal email to send information about their work, make sure that content attachments are encrypted, and avoid using personal or confidentiality data in the subject lines. Before sending an email, make sure you send it to the correct recipient. And if you use paper records at home, make sure to dispose of them securely, and to have a record of what files you have taken at home. In Germany, we saw some additional guidelines for HR personnel, so that the company should remind these employees who handle HR data to how to protect the files at home, and ideally not print at home or not allow others to be present when they take calls, etc. To summarize, we would like to know that in addition to the technical measures for teleworking that we talked about, encryption, multi-factor authentication, and access controls, the DPAs have highlighted also organizational aspects of how to set up your home office in a safe manner for personal data. And now the question that comes up is, do you need country-specific teleworking policies in your organization just because you have local guidance? Not necessarily, because there are ways that you can take a pan-European approach to teleworking. The guidance is not binding, but it gives the best practices and thoughts of regulators. So if you take the best examples from the various teleworking guidance to build your own teleworking policy, this will probably give you a robust teleworking policy that will work in various EU member states. Moving on, I would like to take the last couple of minutes of this presentation to talk about the key tools for management of a GDPR privacy program during the pandemic. Accountability is a key principle of the GDPR, and the GDPR is a law that is heavily based on the principle of demonstrating responsibility and managing risks. So while we are in this crisis situation, you would want to always ensure that you have proper leadership and oversight for your data protection program. If you have not done so already, make sure you always have some alternative resources to utilize in the event senior leadership, members of the privacy team, or the data protection officer become temporarily unavailable or just too busy to deal with their usual tasks because of other crisis emergencies. Internal governance policies is a key accountability element, and some of you may have more or others may have less policies internally, but they may evolve with the situation and they work to, be reviewed, at least some of them, to make sure they're up to date. Data protection impact assessments are tools you'll utilize a lot, especially if you collect health data in the context of the recovery measures. A recommendation for DPIAs in these times is to include detailed descriptions of the envisaged measures for recovery, the potential negative consequences for individuals, and the mitigation measures you envisage. You should also be sure that your records of processing activities are up to date, especially describing the recovery measures you consider taking. And there is, of course, minimum content for these records in the GDPR that you need to maintain, but we would also recommend that the records have some more information that help you run your program. For example, how the information was collected, through questionnaires completed by employees or through automatic use of technical devices. And was the collection voluntary or mandatory per applicable legal requirements related to the pandemic? Last but not least, you will want to make sure that your data subject rights processes are up to speed, given the tight time frames to respond to individuals. So the GDPR allows, as you know, 1 month to respond to a rights request. And there's possibility for extension under circumstances. So if you're considering an extension strategy for data subject rights, make sure you use it with caution, because although the data protection authorities were a little bit more lenient at the beginning of the pandemic, at least with data subject rights, things should now be slowly be moving back to normal. One issue to consider here is that we see an increase of third-party platforms that are used by individuals to submit automatic rights requests to companies. And this, responding to those platforms' requests may take a little bit more time for review of certain issues such as their authorization, etc. So if you're not dealing with that in your policy and you don't have resources available, or the pandemic has slowed down things, these are things to consider while you might be refreshing your data subject rights policy. So before we close this program, we would like to show examples of privacy governance policies that may need to be refreshed during the pandemic as internal process may evolve in some organizations. We will not go into details for each of them because some organizations may have some policies, some may have others, and this really depends on business model and privacy compliance program. But just as an example, let's say in your incident response plan, you may want to take the time now to reassess your monitoring procedures and the frequency of monitoring, and make sure that you always have backup resources and escalation procedures to ensure a timely response to an incident, but also timely notification to a data protection authority when this is required. Because as you know, the timeline is only 72 hours under the GDPR. For your teleworking policy, we would say think of ways to include do's and don'ts for employees working from home regarding how to protect company systems and personal information they're dealing with. Usually signs and icons work well to show safe practices and unsafe practices and be as clear as possible. So I'm mindful of the time here and will not go further with these examples, but just keep them in mind. And with these thoughts, we'd like to close now this presentation.
I will just
back to you, Lisa.
Thank you very much, Anna. I will just say thank you very much for joining us. If you have questions, please do email them to us. We'll get to as many as we can, and we appreciate your participation. Thank you so much.